Some thought scary and true horror stories of people who disappeared on the Mulholland Trail in Los Angeles. Mulholland Trail is the kind of place people imagine when they think of Los Angeles at its best. Sunlight cutting across the hills, open views stretching toward the valley, hikers moving along worn paths with dogs trotting ahead. It sits close enough to the city that you can still hear distant traffic during the day. But once the sun drops behind the ridge, the trail becomes something entirely different. The noise fades, the wind shifts, and the darkness settles in with a weight that feels older than the city surrounding it. Most people who hike there never feel anything unusual. They finish their loop, take a few photos, and drive home without thinking twice. But every so often someone steps a little too far into the quiet. Someone ignores a strange sound. Someone veers off the main path by only a few feet. And then the trail changes. The air pulls tighter around the switchbacks. The familiar markers look slightly off. What should feel like a suburban hike begins to feel like a place that doesn't want you there. Rangers talk about certain nights when the city lights below vanish all at once, as if swallowed by a thick veil. Dog walkers whisper about voices drifting through the chaparral, too intentional to be the wind and too close to be echoes. Search teams mention sections of the trail where GPS signals collapse and compasses spin without direction. They describe cases where footprints continue forward but never turn back, where a runner disappears mid-stride with no sign of struggle, where a hiker's last phone recording points at a section of the ridge that doesn't appear on any map. These disappearances don't make headlines. They don't fit neatly into explanations. They happen quietly, slipping between the noise of the city and the stillness of the hills. And the people who vanish along Mulholland Trail almost always have one detail in common. The last time anyone saw them was at dusk, when the air cools sharply and the shadows lengthen across the path. Tonight, you're going to hear 4 true stories connected by that trail. 4 people who walked into the hills expecting an ordinary evening. 4 people who encountered something that didn't behave like anything human. Something that followed them along the switchbacks, watched from the ridges, or waited in the places where the trail bends too sharply. These are 4 real disappearances that still haunt the Mulholland Trail. He had run the Mulholland Trail so many times he could trace it blindfolded. Early mornings before work, late evenings after traffic died down, weekends when he needed to clear his head. He knew every bend in the ridge, every switchback carved into the hillside, and every point where the trail widened enough to see the lights of the valley below. Running was his ritual, his reset button, and the Mulholland Trail had always felt predictable, safe, even comforting in its routine. On the night he disappeared, he wasn't doing anything unusual. He told his roommate he'd be back before 9. He put on the same running shoes he always used. He parked at the small dirt turnout near the trailhead, locked his car, and started his usual warm-up. The air was cool, a thin breeze moving across the ridge, carrying the dry scent of chaparral and eucalyptus. Nothing about the evening felt strange enough to warn him he shouldn't go. Several hikers later reported seeing him on the first half-mile stretch, the wide section before the trail narrows. They said he looked relaxed, headphones in, pacing himself for a long run. One person even recognized him and waved. He waved back, smiled, and continued uphill toward the ridge. That was the last confirmed sighting before everything shifted. His route was simple. Up the fire road, loop the ridge, return the same way. He had run it in daylight, twilight, and full darkness without issue. But something about that evening carried a stillness he didn't register consciously. The wind died abruptly. The usual sounds of the hillside faded. Even the distant hum of the freeway below seemed to thin out as he climbed. He later told someone he passed on the lower stretch that he felt the air change. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier. Like the atmosphere around him had thickened. He reached the first switchback around 8:10 p.m. The sun was already low, painting the ridge in deep red. From his vantage point, the city should have been glowing beneath him. Instead, the horizon looked muted, as if someone had placed a shadowed sheet over the valley. The lights were there, but dimmer than they should have been. He pulled out one earbud, listening for coyotes or hikers or anything familiar. The hillside gave him nothing in return. He kept running. Just past the second bend, the trail splits for a few feet before converging again. It's a harmless feature. barely noticeable unless you're on a bike. But that night, the runner paused when he reached it. A couple walking behind him later told investigators that he slowed down, turned his head toward the narrower offshoot, and stood completely still. They said he looked confused, as if the trail ahead didn't look the way he remembered it. The couple called out to ask if he was okay, but he didn't answer. He didn't even turn. He simply stepped toward the narrow path. The couple assumed he needed a moment alone and continued on their way. That was the last known moment anyone saw him standing on a trail that should have been familiar in every direction. His phone's GPS track shows he followed the narrow path for 37 steps. Then the signal cut out completely. Not lost, not scrambled, cut off. A dead stop, as if the device had been shut down or dropped into something that blocked everything. Search teams later walked that path dozens of times. It leads to a small overlook, a drop of only a few feet into thick brush. Nothing dangerous, nothing strange. But when rescuers reached the spot where the GPS ended, they found no footprints in the dust, no sign of a fall, no torn clothing, no drag marks, no disturbance at all. The dust looked untouched, like no one had stepped there in hours. The runner should have been visible from the ridge. He should have been heard if he called out. He should have left some trace of where he went next. But the trail past that point was silent, undisturbed, as if he had never taken those final steps at all. Something felt slightly off. Search teams reconstructed everything they could from the last people who saw him. The couple who passed him described the moment he stepped toward the narrow offshoot in a way that didn't sit right with investigators. They said he didn't move like someone who suddenly remembered a different route or someone trying to catch a better view of the sunset. They said he moved like someone following a sound, a very specific sound. His posture was rigid, his head tilted slightly, and his steps were slow, almost measured, as if he were listening to something they couldn't hear. When investigators reviewed the couple's statement, they asked if the runner appeared injured or disoriented. The couple insisted he did not. They said he looked alert, focused, but focused on something unseen. They both remembered the way he seemed to study the narrow path before stepping onto it. The man even said the runner looked like he was responding to someone calling out to him, though he had not heard any voice himself. Later, search teams found a detail that matched that unease. Along the narrow offshoot, the first 10 steps left faint impressions in the dust. Normal stride, normal depth. But the next 5 prints were different. The spacing between steps widened dramatically, as if he had suddenly lengthened his stride. Not jogging, not running. More like leaning forward and being pulled by something. The heel marks became shallow, almost non-existent, while the toe imprints dug deeper into the earth. It looked like he was moving quickly, but not in a way a human runner naturally would. After the 15th step, the prints stopped entirely. Not faded, not smudged, stopped. The dust beyond that point was flat and untouched, marked only by the wind and the occasional lizard trail. Investigators circled the spot again and again, but there was nothing. No scuff, no slide, no broken twigs, no indication that he had jumped the edge or climbed upward. It was as if he had taken one long step into the open air and never returned to the ground. Even stranger was the smell several rescuers reported at that exact location. Not rot, not animal scent, something metallic, warm, almost like the smell of heated wires. It dissipated quickly, fading into the dry air, but 3 separate responders mentioned it without hearing each other's accounts first. The smell didn't match any natural element on that part of the ridge. One member of the initial search team admitted years later that when he stood at the spot where the prints ended, he felt something he couldn't explain. A pressure, a slight tightening of the air around his ribs. Not enough to hurt, just enough to make him take a step back without meaning to. He kept that detail to himself at the time, worried it would sound ridiculous, but when he later heard that other search members described a similar pressure, he realized he hadn't imagined it. The first sign that something was wrong appeared in the runner's abandoned phone as well, not because of what was on it, but because of what wasn't. When the device was eventually found a day later, lodged between 2 rocks several yards off the trail, the battery was completely dead. That wasn't unusual by itself, but the internal logs showed something else. The phone had drained from 60% to zero in under 12 minutes. A drop that technicians said was impossible without physical damage or extreme heat, and the device had neither. More unsettling was the final recorded compass reading before the battery collapse. The magnetometer showed the compass spinning in perfect circles, slow rotations at first, then violent rotations that blurred the digital data. The phone recorded the spinning for 17 seconds before shutting down entirely, and yet the spot where the phone was found had no magnetic interference, no power lines, no metal deposits, nothing that could have caused it. Investigators combed the area again, trying to understand how the runner moved off the trail without leaving any sign of passage, but the ground remained unnaturally clean. The brush around the ridge showed no disturbance. Even the dust held its shape, as if nothing had passed through since the last rainfall. They tried to ignore the strangeness of those details. They tried to rationalize what they found. But then, it got worse. By the second day of the search, the team had expanded their grid well beyond the narrow offshoot. They swept the ravine below the ridge, the brush along the fire road, and even the service paths used by maintenance crews. Nothing turned up. Not a scrap of clothing, not a broken branch, not a single slide mark in the dirt. Experienced rescuers started saying the same thing in hushed tones. He didn't walk out of there. He simply wasn't there anymore. On the afternoon of day 3, the search dog gave the first and only reaction worth noting. The handler brought the dog to the point where the runner's footprints ended. The dog sniffed the ground, circled twice, then backed away abruptly with its tail tucked. The handler tried again, same response. On the third attempt, the dog let out a short, terrified bark and refused to approach the spot. It pulled at the leash hard enough to dig its claws into the dirt. When the handler finally gave up and stepped back, the dog immediately calmed. When they tried to guide the dog forward again from a slightly different angle, it froze, stared at the empty stretch of dust, and began to whine. The search leader wrote, "Area contaminated" in the official notes, but privately he admitted he had never seen a trained search dog react with fear to nothing, especially not fear so intense it prevented the dog from doing its job. That evening, several team members stayed on the ridge longer than planned. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the hillside. One volunteer stood near the split in the trail, looking down the narrow offshoot. He said the air felt wrong, too still, too warm, a heat that didn't match the cooling hillside. He took a few steps toward the overlook where the footprints ended, but the moment he did, the quiet around him deepened. He could no longer hear the other members calling out. Their voices dropped off as if swallowed by something between him and the main trail. He backed up quickly, and the normal sounds of the search returned instantly. He tried again, stepping forward. The air thickened, the temperature rose, the calls faded. Each step he took forward stole more sound from the world around him. He stopped moving and stepped backward onto the main path. The effect vanished again. He repeated this twice more, each time feeling the same unnatural shift. When he finally rejoined the others, he kept his voice low and told only the team leader. The leader didn't respond. He only looked at the volunteer for a long moment, the way someone looks when they're trying to decide whether to admit they feel the same thing. The next morning brought a discovery that unsettled everyone. The runner's headphones were found lying in the brush 15 feet off the main trail, not torn, not tangled, placed. Both earpieces faced upward. The cord coiled neatly beneath them like someone had set them down with intention. The brush around the headphones showed no sign of disturbance. No crushed leaves, no displaced dirt. It looked like the headphones had materialized there without passing through the plants. The strangest detail came from the technician who examined them. The left earpiece held a faint residue on the foam. Not sweat, not dirt. Something metallic. When the technician smelled it, he pulled back sharply. He said it was identical to the smell searchers had reported at the footprint site. Warm metal, heated wires, a scent that didn't belong on a hiking trail. The discovery should have given the team hope. At least it was something. But it had the opposite effect, the placement, the untouched brush, the metallic scent. It felt like a message, a sign left deliberately, as if something was returning pieces of the runner in a way no one could understand. That night, during the final sweep before sunset, 2 searchers standing near the ridge thought they heard footsteps on the narrow offshoot. Slow, precise. moving in their direction. They called out, thinking another member was approaching. No one answered. The footsteps continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly at the point where the runner's prints had ended. When the searchers walked toward the sound, the air grew warmer again, and the smell returned, the metallic heat. They stepped back immediately. By then, they knew something was behind this disappearance, and whatever it was still on the trail. On the fifth evening of the search, the team decided to expand their sweep after dark. It was risky, but they were running out of explanations, and several members believed the runner might have fallen somewhere deeper along the ridge. The sun had already vanished behind the hills, leaving the trail wrapped in dim blue light. Flashlights carved thin beams across the dust. Radios crackled with brief check-ins. The temperature dropped fast, leaving patches of cold air hovering like pockets along the switchbacks. 2 searchers were assigned to walk the narrow offshoot again. Neither wanted the assignment, but both understood protocol. They moved slowly, stepping in unison, calling the runner's name in steady intervals. Each time they called out, the sound faded quicker than it should have, dissolving into the hillside instead of echoing outward. They reached the point where the footprints ended. One searcher kept his light scanning the dirt, replaying every detail he had memorized. The other aimed his flashlight ahead, sweeping the brush. The metallic smell rose around them again, faint but sharp. Both men stiffened. Then came the sound, not footsteps, not breathing, a low hum. Subtle at first, like the vibration of distant machinery, but there were no power lines on that part of the ridge, no generators, no devices capable of producing that tone. The hum grew louder, not in volume, but in presence, as if it was sinking into their bones. One searcher said his teeth began to ache. The other felt pressure build in the center of his chest. They exchanged a brief look, both understanding they should back away. Before they could move, a shape flickered at the edge of their flashlight beams. Not a figure, not an animal, a distortion. The air warped for a moment, bending the light as if heat were rising from asphalt. But the night was cold, and the distortion hung too high off the ground to be heat. The hum pulsed. The distortion grew. Both men stepped back. One called for backup on the radio, but the device only hissed. The static wasn't normal interference. It sounded layered, like something pushing against the radio frequency. He called again, louder this time. Nothing. Then the distortion shifted. It moved sideways in a sudden, unnatural glide. Not fast, not slow, smooth, controlled. Every hair on their arms rose. The searcher with the forward-facing flashlight reached for the other man's arm, but his hand froze mid-air. His light flickered. The beam bent toward the distortion, drawn slightly off its natural angle. The hum sharpened. Something pressed into the ground near the end of the footprints. Not a footstep, a weight. A single heavy pressure that pushed a shallow indentation into the dirt. Both men saw it form in real time. The earth dipped just enough to register movement, but nothing visible stood above it. Another indentation appeared 2 feet to the right, then another, each one perfectly spaced, as if something invisible was stepping toward them. The men stumbled backward, breath locked in their throats. One tried to shine the beam directly at the indentations, but the light bent again, bending away from the center point. He shouted for the team again, still static. The distortion reached the end of the offshoot. Then it stopped. Silence dropped like a weight. The metallic scent thickened. One searcher said the air behind him shifted, as if something large had moved into position without sound. He didn't turn. He couldn't. Every instinct he had told him to stay facing forward. Then the hum changed pitch. A sharp, needle-thin tone stabbed through the air, vibrating the dirt under their feet. The men flinched. One fell to a knee. The other grabbed his shoulder. Their flashlights sputtered. The narrow offshoot behind them darkened. Not from nightshade. From something blocking what little ambient light remained. The kneeling searcher forced himself to look back. He didn't see a figure. He saw nothing at all. A patch of absolute blackness standing on the trail where light refused to exist. A void. A shape defined only by absence. The hum cut out instantly. The void collapsed inward. The man gasped. The dirt erupted in a sharp crack, like a pop of static electricity. And then the kneeling searcher felt himself being pulled forward by his vest. Not grabbed, pulled, as if gravity had shifted. His partner lunged, grabbing him under the arms and dragging him backward. The void pulsed once more, then thinned, compressing itself into the air before disappearing entirely. The men scrambled backward onto the main trail, choking on adrenaline. Their radios crackled back to life. The scent vanished. The hum faded, but the dents in the dirt remained, and the searchers were certain of one thing. Whatever took the runner that night almost took one of them too. By the 6th day, the official search was still underway, but the tone had shifted. Search teams no longer spoke with the confident determination they carried at the start. Now they moved with hesitation, avoiding the narrow offshoot unless ordered. The two searchers who had witnessed the distortion refused to walk that part of the trail alone. They stayed close to the main switchback, radios in hand, eyes on the dirt for any sign the ground might shift again. Late that afternoon, during a final sweep before nightfall, a volunteer found something wedged between two stones not far from the overlook. A single running shoe, clean, untorn, upright, as if placed by hand. The laces were still tied. The tread held no dirt or dust, suggesting it hadn't been walked to that position. The volunteer called it in immediately. When the lead investigator arrived, he crouched beside the shoe without touching it and stared for a long time. It wasn't the discovery itself that unsettled him. It was the fact that the shoe was warm. Warm despite being in the shade. Warm despite the cool air. Warm as if someone had been standing in it only moments earlier. They checked the surrounding dirt for prints. Nothing. They examined the rocks for scratches. Nothing. They tested the temperature difference again. Still warm. The investigator wrote, "Likely placed recently," in his notes, but he didn't say aloud what everyone was thinking. No one had seen or heard anyone on that section of the ridge for hours. That night, as the sun slipped behind the skyline of the valley, several searchers reported hearing something faint moving along the brush. Not footsteps, something lighter. A soft tapping, spaced evenly, like fingers brushing the chaparral. It circled the area in a slow, deliberate arc, always staying just beyond their flashlight beams. When they tried to follow the sound, it shifted locations, appearing behind them, then to the side, then vanishing entirely. One searcher swore he saw a shape standing at the end of the narrow offshoot, a tall, unmoving outline where the trail met the ridge. He blinked, and it disappeared. When he inspected the spot, the metallic smell returned. They ended the day early. The official report concluded the runner likely fell, became disoriented, or attempted to cross the ridge and was injured. But privately, none of the responders believed that. The missing footprints, the dead phone, the spinning compass, the warm shoe, the distortion that bent flashlight beams, the hum that vibrated in their bones, the void that swallowed sound. Each detail ate away at the accepted explanations. The final sweep on day 7 brought the strangest discovery of all. At the exact point where the runner's prints ended, the dust held a new indentation, not as deep as a footprint, not human in shape. A shallow, elongated impression at least 2 feet long, curved slightly, as if something heavy had rested there briefly. A searcher touched the edge of it with his glove. The dirt felt warm again. They left the ridge as the sun dropped behind the hills, the air thick and unmoving. None of them spoke during the walk back to the vehicles. It wasn't fear of what they had seen. It was fear of what they didn't. 3 weeks later, a hiker taking photos near the same overlook submitted a note to local authorities. He said he heard a low hum on the trail around sunset. He said he felt the air tighten around his chest, like he had walked into a pressure pocket. He said he turned toward the narrow offshoot and saw something that made him back away slowly. He described it as a patch of darkness standing on the trail. He said it was shaped like a person, but had no edges. He said when he blinked, it vanished. He insisted he hadn't heard about the disappearance before that moment. The runner was never found. No remains, no clothing, no signs of a fall or injury. His car stayed untouched at the trailhead for days until his family collected it. To this day, search teams avoid the narrow offshoot after dusk. Hikers who know the story warn newcomers not to take that part of the trail when the wind dies and the city lights dim unexpectedly. They say the ridge gets quiet in a way that doesn't feel natural. They say the air tightens just enough to make you stop walking. And they say if you hear a hum on Mulholland Trail, even faintly, you should turn back immediately, because no one has seen him since. The official search for the runner ended quietly, the way most disappearances on Mulholland Trail end. No press conferences, no dramatic explanations. Just a slow withdrawal of search teams, a few brief updates, and a final note filed into a system already crowded with missing person reports that never found resolution. But for the people who were on that ridge, the story didn't end with paperwork. It lingered in their minds, a weight that settled into the way they moved through the trail afterward. Several of the rescuers never returned to that section again. They switched shifts, changed assignments, or simply refused to respond to calls anywhere near the narrow offshoot. Some said the place felt wrong now, as if the air held memory. Others couldn't explain what bothered them. They only said the silence in that part of the trail didn't behave like normal silence. It pressed inward. It swallowed sound. It made them feel like something unseen was choosing when to let them hear the world and when to hide it. And that was only one disappearance. Because Mulholland Trail has a history that never makes it into tourist guides or hiking blogs. People vanish in small, quiet ways, slipping into gaps that shouldn't exist. Some show up later in disoriented states, unable to remember how they left the main path. Others are never found at all. Those who return often talk about strange moments they can't articulate, a sudden drop in sound, a warm patch of air on a cold night, a voice calling from the wrong direction, a flicker of movement at the edge of the trail that disappears when they turn. The next case didn't involve a runner. It didn't happen late at night, and it didn't involve someone exploring unfamiliar territory. The second disappearance was different because it happened in broad daylight, on a section of the trail so close to the road that hikers pass it without even slowing down. It happened to someone who lived in the area for years, someone who walked Mulholland Trail almost every afternoon, someone who knew the hills better than most locals. She wasn't lost, she wasn't confused, she didn't wander off the main path. She had walked that same stretch of trail for so long that she could predict every dip and rise blind. The woman who went missing that day vanished in a space where she should have been seen by multiple people, a place where footprints should have stayed visible in the dust, a place so open that losing sight of someone for more than a few seconds should have been impossible. Yet she disappeared without making a single sound. Her family described her as grounded, cautious, predictable in her routines. She carried water, snacks, and a walking stick. She followed the same trail almost every time, and on the day she vanished, she texted her daughter only 10 minutes before she was last seen. The text contained nothing unusual, no fear, no confusion, just a simple message confirming she'd be home soon. Hikers walking ahead of her reported nothing strange. The ones behind her said they saw her silhouette on the ridge. Then, as they rounded the bend, she was gone. No sound, no struggle, no sign she stepped off the trail. Later, investigators found something she left behind. Something small, something easily overlooked, something placed in a way that didn't make sense. And that small detail is where her story begins. She was the kind of person everyone in the neighborhood recognized, not because she sought attention, but because she followed the same afternoon routine with almost ritualistic consistency. Every day at 4:30, she left her house on the edge of the valley, locked the gate behind her, and walked up toward the Mulholland Trail. She moved with an easy confidence, the kind that comes from years of knowing exactly where your feet should land on familiar ground. People often waved to her from their cars. Some even joked that she was part of the landscape, as dependable as the trail itself. On the day she disappeared, everything about her routine was normal. Weather was mild, the sky clear, the sun already beginning its slow tilt toward the horizon. She wore the same lightweight jacket, black hiking pants, and the well-worn shoes she trusted. She stopped at the same small market at the corner, bought a bottle of water, and chatted briefly with the cashier. Her daughter later said she sounded calm and happy on the phone, asking about dinner plans and reminding her to take something out of the freezer. Nothing about her voice hinted at fear or distraction. She reached the trail around 5:15. That stretch of Mulholland feels more open than most. The hillsides widen, the vegetation pulls back slightly, and the path runs parallel to the road for several hundred feet before curving around a slow bend. Cars pass close enough that you can still hear engines humming behind you. It's one of the safest sections of the entire trail. Broad visibility, clear sightlines, regular foot traffic. Families walk there. Runners train there. No one expects anything strange to happen in that space. Hikers who saw her that day described her the same way they always had. Steady pace, relaxed posture, walking stick in her right hand. She nodded at a few people as she passed, offering the same polite smile she gave everyone. One woman remembered seeing her stop briefly near a wooden postmarker, adjusting the strap of her water bottle. After that, she continued toward the bend, just as she always did. That bend matters. It's shallow, harmless, easy to navigate. You can see around it from both directions. It is the kind of turn that doesn't hide anything, unless someone is only a few steps ahead of you. And that is exactly where she was when two hikers behind her noticed something they couldn't explain. They said she reached the bend and paused, not for long, just long enough to turn her head slightly, as if checking something on the slope to her right. The hikers assumed she had spotted a bird or perhaps a coyote moving through the brush. They weren't close enough to see her expression, but they both remembered the way she leaned forward, curious, studying something. When they rounded the bend themselves less than 10 seconds later, the trail ahead was empty. She wasn't far enough ahead to outrun them. She wasn't fast enough to vanish from sight that quickly, and the dust on the trail should have shown where she went next. But the ground held nothing except the prints she made before the bend. No fresh tracks leading forward. No tracks veering toward the slope. No marks suggesting she had slipped or fallen. She was simply gone. At first, the hikers thought she might have stepped off the path to look at something in the brush. They called out to her. No answer. They checked the slope. No movement. They walked a little farther ahead, expecting to see her silhouette reappear at any moment. It never did. It took almost an hour before anyone realized something was truly wrong. Her daughter called and received no answer. Another family friend texted. Nothing. When evening crept in and the temperature began to drop, her daughter drove to the trailhead herself. She found her mother's car parked exactly where it always was, keys not in the ignition, nothing disturbed. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place, but then something on the ground caught her eye. Her mother's walking stick, not snapped, not dropped, placed, perfectly parallel to the trail, pointing toward the bend. Something felt slightly off. Her daughter crouched beside the walking stick, confused by how carefully it had been left there. The dirt around it was undisturbed, no scuff marks, no drag, no sign it had been dropped during a fall or snapped free in panic. The base of the stick rested in a shallow patch of dust, and the imprint it left was too clean, too intentional, as though someone had pressed it gently into the earth and stepped away without leaving any trace of their own movement. It pointed directly toward the bend in the trail. She lifted the stick and felt something strange beneath her fingertips, a faint warmth, almost like the wood had been held moments earlier. But the sun had already lowered behind the ridge, and the air carried a cool bite. She told herself it was only residual heat from the day and set it aside. Still, the oddity clung to her mind. When search teams arrived, they examined the area around the bend with the same methodical steps they used on every missing person call. They followed the trail forward first. No prints. They checked the loose gravel near the slope. Nothing. They scanned the brush for signs of disturbance. Still nothing. The dust was untouched, the vegetation unbroken, the rocks unmoved. It looked as though she had reached the bend, stopped, and simply ceased to exist. A searcher walked a few steps ahead and paused. He noticed something subtle along the right edge of the trail. A patch of dust, perfectly smooth, stretched about 2 feet across the ground, not blown by wind, not flattened by shoes, completely undisturbed, as if the dust had settled into place moments earlier. He brushed his glove across the surface gently, expecting the top layer to shift. But the dust clung unusually tight, almost like humidity had settled in the soil. Except the air was bone dry. He looked to the slope again and tried to listen for anything that might have drawn her attention. A bird, a rustle, the scraping of an animal in the brush. Nothing drifted through the thickening air. Even the faint hum of the road behind them felt distant, muffled in a way that didn't match the landscape. The silence was too complete. One of the responders pointed out something else. A smell, almost imperceptible at first. Warm metal. A faint tang, like someone had heated an old piece of wire. The odor drifted only near the bend, nowhere else on the trail. It was the kind of scent that didn't belong in the open air of the hillside. The searchers exchanged uneasy glances, but continued working. The metallic smell faded quickly, evaporating into the evening breeze. As they spread out along the trail, one of the volunteers called out that he'd found something farther up the path. The group hurried to him expecting clothing, a dropped bottle, or tracks leading away. Instead, they found a small white stone. Ordinary, unremarkable, except for two details. First, the stone was warm, warmer than the air, warm as if someone had held it tightly. Second, it wasn't from the trail. It didn't match the surrounding geology. It didn't match the rocks scattered across the hillside. It was smooth in a way the local stone wasn't, its shape too polished to have been weathered by wind on that ridge. One searcher remarked that it felt almost like a river stone, the kind found miles away in different terrain. But there was no river anywhere near that part of Mulholland, and no one could explain why it had been placed neatly in the center of the trail, in a spot where she would have seen it if she had continued walking. They marked the location and expanded the search grid again, checking every direction the stone pointed. Nothing connected. No prints, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. No indication she had touched the stone. It felt like a clue without context, a detail left behind for unclear reasons. As daylight faded completely, a few searchers prepared to sweep the trail once more from the beginning. When they turned back toward the bend, several of them froze. The air didn't look normal. A faint ripple moved across the space near the slope, bending the dimming light in a subtle wave. It lasted only a second before the air settled again. One searcher asked if anyone else had seen it. Two others nodded quietly. They checked the area immediately. The ground was smooth again. The metallic smell drifted back, and the walking stick, which her daughter had moved earlier, now lay perfectly parallel to the trail once more. Placed in the exact orientation as before, they tried to ignore it. They tried to rationalize it. But then it got worse. By the time the second evening sweep began, the trail felt different. The air carried a heaviness that several searchers commented on without realizing others felt it too. A strange compression, as if the atmosphere around the bend had thickened in a way no one could fully describe. Flashlights cut through the dusk with narrow beams, but the light seemed to fade faster than usual. It didn't travel the full distance it should have. It fell short, swallowed by something unseen in the gathering dark. A small team moved toward the bend with measured steps. The lead searcher paused periodically to listen for anything that might indicate where she had gone. A call for her name echoed down the trail, but the sound didn't travel far. It seemed to slide sideways, as though the hillside itself shifted the echo in a direction no one intended. One volunteer mentioned a faint static buzzing in his ears, like the hum of distant power lines. But when he checked the sky, there were no lines overhead. Another searcher felt his compass vibrate lightly in his pocket. When he pulled it out, the needle quivered without settling on any direction. He tapped the glass. The needle stuttered again, swinging a few degrees left, then dropping dead still. They moved forward. At the bend, the ground remained untouched. The prints she had made walking in were still there, crisp and clear, but nothing continued beyond them. A searcher crouched to examine the soil again. He rested his hand above the surface without touching it, and a tremor ran through him. The dust felt warm, not hot, warm, like someone had just stepped off that exact spot. He checked the temperature with the back of his hand. The air felt cooler above it, almost cold, but the soil held heat with no logical explanation. He stood quickly and took a step back. Behind them, a soft tapping sound drifted up the slope. 3 taps, evenly spaced, like someone knocking on hollow wood. The team turned in unison, flashlights aimed toward the sound. The slope was empty. No movement, no animals, no hikers, just dense chaparral and rust-colored dirt. They called out again, hoping the tapping was a lost hiker signaling for help. No answer came. A few seconds passed. Then the tapping returned, closer this time, as if something had shifted 20 feet toward them, without disturbing a single branch. One of the searchers whispered that the air had thickened again. His voice sounded strained, as if speaking required pushing through invisible resistance. The others felt it too, a faint tightening around their ribs, subtle but unmistakable. Something was pressing in, something was closing the space around them. A gust of warm wind rushed across the trail, short and sudden. It carried that same metallic scent, the same heated wire smell they had encountered earlier. It swirled around the group in a narrow arc before dissipating into the cooler air behind them. Several searchers stepped back automatically, instinct overriding reason. Then a flashlight flickered, not because the battery drained, not because of interference. The beam bent. The light curved toward the slope, as though pulled by a slight gravitational shift. The searcher holding it gasped and shook the flashlight, but the beam continued bending for several seconds before snapping back into place. The group backed up 3 steps without being told. Another searcher glanced behind them down the trail and froze. He swore he saw a figure standing further back along the ridge, a silhouette, tall, still, watching. When another flashlight swept over the area, the space was empty. Only dust and low shrubs remained, but the searcher insisted he had seen something, not a person, not an animal, something motionless in a way that made no sense. The radios crackled with a burst of static, sharp, loud, then dead silence. The team leader tried again, but every transmission dissolved into a distorted buzz. The more they tried, the clearer it became that the interference wasn't random. It felt intentional, like the static responded to their attempts to communicate. Another tapping sound rose from the slope, then another, then a third. This time, the taps formed a perfect triangular rhythm, measured, controlled, calling attention to the bend in the trail without revealing what created them. One volunteer whispered that they should retreat. Before anyone could agree, the ground near the bend trembled. A small shiver in the dust, too slight to be movement, too strong to be imagination. The metal scent surged again. The searchers stepped back in unison, breath locked in their throats. They didn't see what caused the tremor, but every person on that ridge felt it. By then, they knew they were not searching alone. The team leader signaled for everyone to hold position, but the command came out tight and uneven, as if the air resisted his voice. Night had settled fully over the ridge now, leaving the trail in a thin wash of moonlight and fractured shadows. Flashlights scattered white beams across the dust, but the darkness between them felt thicker than it should have been. The bend ahead seemed to swallow the light as fast as they cast it. A sudden shift in the temperature made several searchers flinch. A pocket of warm air pressed against their faces, followed immediately by an icy breath at their backs. The contrast hit so sharply that one volunteer staggered. The group tightened formation without discussing it. Instinct drew them closer. A sound rose from the slope. Not tapping this time, something softer. A drag across the dirt, long, slow, controlled, like a fingertip tracing a curve. The noise climbed upward in a deliberate path, stopping just short of the trail as if something stood just out of sight, waiting. One searcher stepped forward despite the others grabbing his arm. His light quivered as he raised it toward the slope. The beam didn't illuminate brush or rock. It hit something else first. The light bent again, warping in mid-air before reaching its target. A thin arc, slight but undeniable. He tried angling the flashlight differently, but each adjustment curved in the same unnatural way. He took a step backward. Behind the group, a crunch echoed from the trail they had just walked. A single footstep, a single deliberate placement of weight on gravel. Every head snapped toward the sound. The flashlight swung wildly. The trail was empty. The dust remained undisturbed, but the step had been unmistakable, heavy, human, close. No one moved, no one breathed. The radios let out another burst of static, louder than before. This time the distortion carried a faint pattern, like distant breathing woven into the noise. The team leader tried to call dispatch anyway. The static answered him in a broken rhythm that didn't match any interference they had heard during previous searches. Something about the sound felt responsive, almost aware. Then the slope exhaled. A wave of warm air swept across the bend, strong enough to push loose dust across the trail. The searchers shielded their faces. When the dust settled, they saw something new etched into the ground near the smooth patch they'd examined earlier. Impressions. 3 shallow marks pressed into the soil. Not footprints, not paw prints. Long, narrow indentations arranged in a perfect arc, as if something heavy had rested there for a moment. The earth still glowed faintly from the warmth. One volunteer whispered that the impressions looked fresh. Another pointed out that they hadn't been there minutes earlier. The team leader crouched, reaching toward the marks but stopping short of touching them. He held his hand above one indentation. Heat radiated upward, a steady pulse, almost like a slow heartbeat. Before he could warn the team, a low hum swelled from behind them. The searchers spun, flashlights trembling. At first, the darkness looked empty. Then, someone gasped. A shape hovered at the far edge of the trail. Not a person, not an animal. A silhouette darker than the night around it. A void with the suggestion of height and presence, but no edges, no features, no form that the human eye could fully register. It wavered like a shadow standing without a source. No one ran, they couldn't. Their bodies locked in place, breath caught between fear and disbelief. The hum intensified, vibrating the ground beneath their boots. One searcher clutched his chest, eyes wide. The shadow shifted slightly, tilting in an angle that suggested it was turning its attention toward them. The flashlights aimed at it flickered, as if the darkness absorbed the beams rather than reflected them. The void moved, not forward, not backward, sideways. It glided along the ridge, cutting across moonlight in a way that left a thin trail of distortion behind it, like heat rising from asphalt. When it passed the bend, every beam of light bent toward it. The metallic scent flooded the air. A jolt shook the ground. The void halted. The hum stopped abruptly. Silence crushed the space around them. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the shadow collapsed inward. Not fading, not drifting, collapsing. Like an implosion of darkness that left nothing behind but the stillness of the hillside. The team stood frozen until someone finally whispered that they needed to leave immediately. They backed away from the bend, unable to look away from the empty patch of trail where the void had been. The radios crackled back to normal. The temperature stabilized. The metallic scent thinned, but the impressions in the dirt remained warm, and the trail behind them stayed unnervingly quiet. Whatever had taken the woman hadn't left the ridge. It had simply stepped aside. The search for her went on for 7 days, each one stretching longer than the last, as the trail seemed to resist giving up any trace of her. The investigators expanded their grid far beyond the bend, sweeping the hillside, the ravines, and every service road that threaded through the ridge. Nothing appeared, no clothing, no prints, no broken branches, not a single sign she had ever stepped off the main path. It was as if the trail itself had absorbed her. On the final evening before the search was scaled back, a volunteer found something unsettling tucked under a low shrub just beyond the bend. It was her water bottle, the same one she had purchased that afternoon from the market, the same price sticker still half attached. The bottle was upright, balanced perfectly in a shallow dip of dirt where it could not have rolled naturally. The exterior was clean, untouched by dust, as if placed there intentionally. When the volunteer picked it up, he felt a faint warmth through the plastic. He checked the cap. It was tightly sealed. The water inside was cool. The bottle itself was warm. He handed it to the team leader without speaking. The leader stared at it for a long moment, then set it down gently. He stood still, listening to the drift of air around them. The wind over the ridge shifted strangely, not moving across the hillside but curling in short, tight spirals, brushing past their legs like fingertips. The metallic scent returned, drifting over them in a thin strand of heat. They swept the slope once more, until the last threads of sunlight died completely. As darkness settled, the radios flickered again. Not static this time. A faint tone emerged through the interference, a soft harmonic vibration rising and falling in a rhythm that didn't match any mechanical source. One searcher insisted later it sounded almost like breathing. Another thought it resembled someone humming far away. A human cadence twisted through a broken signal. Then it stopped. The radios went silent. The wind died. Even the city noise below seemed to dim for a moment. That was when one searcher noticed something glinting near the bend. A small object lying in the dust. He knelt to pick it up and realized it was a ring. Thin, silver, slightly bent, not broken, just warped into a subtle curve. Her daughter confirmed later that her mother had worn that ring every day for nearly 20 years. She never removed it, yet the ring was warm too. When the team searched the dirt around the ring, they found another strange detail. A mark in the soil, not a footprint, not an animal track. A smooth indentation shaped like a crescent, the dirt pressed evenly from end to end. It wasn't deep, but it was precise. Too precise for the loose soil of the ridge. It looked as though a heavy object had rested there for a moment before vanishing again. The edges were crisp, the interior warm. A volunteer suggested photographing the indentation, but when he reached for his phone, the screen flickered. The battery icon dropped from 60% to 0 in seconds. The device shut off. Another searcher's flashlight stuttered, dimmed, then surged with a blinding burst of light before stabilizing. Someone whispered that they needed to leave. The team leader agreed without hesitation. They retreated down the trail as a group, none of them willing to turn their back to the bend. Several searchers later admitted they felt watched the entire walk back. Not followed, watched. As if something had settled at the edge of the trail and tracked them with silent intent. When they finally reached the vehicles, the radios regained full clarity. The wind returned to normal. The ridge behind them stood quiet and still, nothing visibly out of place. The official report concluded that she likely stepped off the trail and became lost. But even the investigators who wrote the summary didn't believe it. Her walking stick placed with intention, her water bottle standing upright, the warm stone, the warped ring, the bending flashlight beams, the hum in the radios. The impression in the soil shaped like nothing that should have been there, and the absence of footprints. Not one, not anywhere. 2 days after the search ended, a jogger passing the bend reported something strange. He said he heard a soft tapping coming from the slope. 3 taps, evenly spaced. He said he called out, thinking someone needed help. No one answered. When he turned to leave, a warm gust of wind pressed against his back. He looked over his shoulder and swore he saw a silhouette at the bend. Not a person, not an animal. A darkness shaped like a figure but without edges or detail. When he blinked, it was gone. Investigators told him he must have mistaken shadow for movement. He disagreed, and no one has seen her since. After the second disappearance, Mulholland Trail developed a reputation that people only mentioned in quiet conversations or late-night warnings. Hikers began avoiding the bend near dusk. Runners changed their routes. Dog walkers refused to pass that section when the wind shifted strangely or when the evening light dimmed sooner than expected. No official alert was ever issued, no signs were posted. But the locals knew. Word travels fast among people who spend their afternoons on narrow trails and ridgelines. They recognize when a place begins to feel wrong. The strangest detail wasn't that 2 people vanished in the same general area. Trails around Los Angeles see their share of accidents, lost hikers, and rare cases that never find resolution. What unsettled people was the way the disappearances overlapped in mood and pattern. Both individuals were familiar with the trail. Both vanished without leaving footprints. Both left behind objects placed with deliberate precision. Both cases carried the same unnatural heat in the soil and the same metallic scent drifting through the air like a breath from something unseen. But the third disappearance was different in a way that rattled even the skeptics. It didn't happen near the bend. It didn't involve someone walking alone, and it didn't occur during twilight or in one of the quiet pockets of the trail. The third case took place in a part of the ridge so close to the road that you could hear passing cars every few seconds. Streetlights glowed in the distance. Houses lined the nearby hillside. It was the last place anyone expected something strange to occur, let alone something that would mirror the earlier vanishings. A group of 3 friends had decided to hike the trail after dinner, using flashlights to follow the ridge while they talked about work and weekend plans. They weren't inexperienced, they weren't careless, they stayed on the main path the entire time. At one point they even joked about the local stories of people disappearing. None of them believed any of it. They said the trail felt completely ordinary. Quiet, but ordinary. 30 minutes later, one of them was gone. Not behind, not ahead, gone. The friends insisted he had been talking one moment and silent the next. When they turned to look at him, the flashlight beams hit nothing but dust and chaparral. They called his name repeatedly. They retraced their steps. They scanned the path with growing panic. They even phoned him, expecting to hear his ringtone echo somewhere in the brush. What they found instead was something the investigators couldn't explain. His flashlight, still on, standing upright, balanced perfectly in the center of the trail, facing a direction no one had walked, and the beam, instead of shining straight, bent to the side, curving as if pulled by something just out of view. The next disappearance on Mulholland Trail didn't feel like someone who stepped wrong or wandered off. It felt like someone was taken in the middle of a conversation. And that is where the third story begins. They weren't the type to scare easily. The three friends worked in the same office, lived in the same general area, and hiked the Mulholland Trail often enough that it became their default plan whenever they needed to decompress after long days. Two of them were lifelong Los Angeles locals who had grown up exploring the hills around the valley. The third had moved to California only a year earlier, but he adapted quickly, developing a fascination with the contrast between the city's sprawling lights and the silence of the ridge above it. On the night he vanished, nothing about their plan was unusual. They had dinner together in Studio City, walked to their cars, and met again at the small turnout near the trailhead a few minutes later. The air was cool but not cold. The sky was clear. The city glowed with its usual haze, a blanket of muted oranges and yellows creeping up toward the ridge. The trail wasn't empty either. They passed two runners heading out as they were coming in. Everything felt normal. The three of them laughed about work drama. They talked about weekend plans. They debated whether the stories of disappearances on the trail were real or just local rumors blown out of proportion. The one who vanished, the newest of the group, had been teasing the others, insisting that the idea of people being taken by the hills was ridiculous. He said Los Angeles had enough real problems without imaginary creatures living in the brush above Mulholland Drive. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't uneasy. If anything, he was the one pushing the group to walk a little farther before turning back. They kept a steady pace along the ridge, their flashlights forming three overlapping beams on the ground. The night was calm. The wind brushed lightly through the chaparral, carrying the faint smell of eucalyptus and warmed earth. Insects buzzed occasionally. A car passed the road nearby, headlights briefly catching the edge of the trail. Nothing felt off or threatening. If anything, the night seemed calmer than usual. They reached the midpoint of their usual route when the conversation shifted. The man who later disappeared told a story from his childhood, something about a camping trip and getting lost for a few minutes. He laughed at the memory. The others joked that he'd better not wander off now. He waved the comment away. Then he stepped forward to adjust the angle of his flashlight. That moment stayed burned in their memory. He was in front of them, talking, moving, turning slightly to gesture with his free hand. Then he went quiet, not startled, not confused, gone quiet. The two friends assumed at first that he was pausing to think, maybe switching to another story. But when they stepped forward, their beams hit empty trail. No figure, no movement, no sound. The dirt ahead of them reflected smooth, undisturbed, exactly as it had been moments earlier. They called his name, loudly, then louder. They walked a few steps ahead. Nothing. They turned their lights toward the slope. Nothing. They scanned the ridge behind them. Still nothing. The trail was wide open, impossible to lose sight of someone on unless they ran or jumped off the side. But there was no rustle, no scurry, no sound of slipping gravel, just silence, thick, heavy, almost immediate. The two friends kept spinning, expecting his voice to rise from somewhere nearby. Instead, something else caught their attention, a dim white glow reflecting off the dust behind them. They turned as one. Sitting upright in the center of the trail was his flashlight, perfectly vertical, balanced in a way that made no sense on the uneven ground, still switched on. The beam pointed not forward, not toward where he had been walking, but toward the chaparral, angled at a slightly unnatural tilt, as though the light were drawn to something out of sight. One of the friends reached for the flashlight, but stopped when he noticed the way the beam bent. Not flickered. Bent, curving slightly toward a patch of brush that should have revealed movement if anything had passed through. There was nothing. They called his name again. No answer. They checked their phones. No signal. The air warmed around them, faintly at first, then unnervingly. Something felt slightly off. The two friends stood frozen, staring at the flashlight standing upright in the center of the trail. The beam didn't behave like normal light. It stretched forward, then veered slightly to the right, bending at an angle that wasn't the result of fog, dust, or movement. It was as if the light were being tugged towards something just beyond the chaparral, pulled the way a magnet bends iron filings. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Neither of the friends wanted to say it aloud, but both felt it immediately. One of them whispered that maybe he had dropped the flashlight while turning, but there was no way a dropped flashlight would land perfectly upright. Not on that uneven soil, not balanced in a way that defied gravity. The trail wasn't flat. It sloped slightly to the left, just enough that any object placed there rolled or tilted automatically. Yet the flashlight stood as straight as if anchored into the earth. The air around it felt warmer than before. The heat radiated upward in a faint pulse, a glow of temperature rather than light. When one of the friends reached out his hand, stopping inches above the flashlight, he felt the warmth clearly, the way you might feel a sun-baked stone still holding heat after nightfall. But the ground around the flashlight was cool. Only that single narrow column of air carried warmth. They called out again for their friend. Louder now. Panic threaded into their voices. They listened for a slip of loose gravel, a branch snapping, a shout, anything. But the night held its silence. Not even the insects that had been buzzing moments earlier seemed willing to make a sound. The friend closest to the flashlight finally forced himself to step forward. He bent down carefully, fingers trembling, and lifted the flashlight from the ground. The moment he did, the warmth vanished. The air cooled instantly, as though whatever had caused the heat had retreated the second the object was removed from its place. He turned the flashlight in his hand. It was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been, but the lens had no dirt on it, no scratches, no sign it had ever struck the ground. Then he noticed something else. The beam flickered once, not weakly, reactively, as if responding to something unseen. The friend holding the light swung it toward the slopes on both sides of the trail. The beam extended normally for a moment, steadied, then curved again, just slightly, toward the chaparral on the right. He aimed the light higher, toward the ridge. It curved again, bending gently toward a point in the brush where nothing moved. The smell hit them next. Warm metal, not the scent of cars or old pipes or electrical lines. It smelled like heated wires, the same faint metallic tang that search teams in the earlier disappearances had described. The friends didn't know that detail yet, but they both frowned as the odor drifted through the air. It didn't belong outdoors. It didn't belong on any hiking trail. It belonged near machinery, near electricity, near something artificial, something warm. One of them stepped closer to the chaparral, keeping the flashlight steady. The beam uselessly curved again, as if refusing to illuminate whatever lay beyond that invisible barrier. He parted the brush slowly, half expecting an animal to scurry out. But the vegetation looked untouched. No movement, no broken branches, no sign that anything had pushed through the leaves in the last several minutes. Then the silence changed. It didn't break, it deepened. The night noise didn't return. The silence thickened as if the air itself had tightened around them, muffling sound in a way that didn't feel natural. They could hear each other breathe, but the sounds felt distant, as if separated by a thin layer of pressure. One friend said he felt the air push back when he inhaled, as though something warm was surrounding them in a slow, deliberate way. He stepped back quickly. He pointed the flashlight down the trail again, desperate for some logical explanation. That was when they saw it. A faint impression in the dust, not a footprint, not a shoe print. Something long and shallow pressing the soil in a smooth curve, new, fresh, and warm. They didn't have the language to explain it, but they both felt the same thing. Whatever happened to their friend had begun before they realized he was gone. They tried to ignore the implications. They tried to rationalize the impossible. But then it got worse. The two friends backed away from the faint impression in the dust, their breath tightening as they tried to make sense of what they were looking at. The mark wasn't deep, but it was impossibly clean. A smooth indentation with edges so crisp that it looked pressed into the earth by deliberate weight. The dirt around it was untouched. No scattered pebbles, no smear of movement, no sign of drag. Something had rested there without stepping into place, and the soil inside the indentation felt warm, pulsing with a faint heat that neither friend could ignore. They called out again for their missing friend, this time with desperation cutting through their voices. The sound didn't travel, it didn't echo. It didn't behave the way their calls normally did on the ridge. Their voices thinned out a few feet from their mouths, dissolving into the air as if swallowed by something waiting at the edges of the trail. The friend, holding the flashlight, waved the beam slowly across the hillside. The light curved again, bending in a soft arc toward the same patch of chaparral it had pointed to earlier. He tightened his grip. The beam bent harder. It wasn't flickering. It was resisting. A cold tremor ran through both men. They stepped backward in tandem. Then the wind shifted. A warm gust swept across the trail, stronger this time, brushing their faces with a heat that carried the metallic scent more sharply than before. The warmth wasn't random. It moved with intention, sweeping around them in a slow circle. When it reached the spot where the flashlight had been standing, the dust trembled subtly, as though responding to an invisible presence moving past. One of the friends whispered that they shouldn't stay. The other agreed, but neither turned fully away. Something about the air made it impossible to retreat outright. They backed up one step at a time, flashlights trembling in their hands as the pressure around them tightened. The slope to their right rustled softly. Not the rustle of an animal, not the movement of wind through dry leaves. Something slower, more rhythmic. A sound like fingertips brushing across rough stems. The friend closest to the slope aimed his flashlight toward the sound. The beam bent sharply, curving toward a spot in the brush 3 feet off the ground. He tried adjusting the angle. The beam corrected itself, as if locking onto a point he couldn't see. Then something exhaled, not wind, a breath, warm, slow, too close. The friend jumped back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The air thickened with heat, the metallic scent flaring at the edges. The brush didn't move, but the feeling of something leaning out from behind it hung heavy and undeniable. They both froze as a faint vibration rippled beneath their feet. The dust shifted, not forward, not outward, downward. A subtle collapse, like something beneath the trail had pressed upward and then released tension. The vibration traveled through the soles of their shoes and up their legs, a pulse so low it felt more sensed than heard. The radios clipped to their belts crackled violently. Static burst through the air, sharp and distorted. But in the middle of it, something threaded through the noise. A pattern, a cadence, the shape of a voice buried beneath interference. Not clear enough to understand, but unmistakably structured like speech. They stood paralyzed, listening as the static fluctuated. The hidden cadence rose, stuttered, then dropped. The second friend slammed his hand against his radio, trying to shut it off. It didn't respond. The static twisted again. A shape of something human inside the noise, woven through the electrical distortion. The friend holding the flashlight whispered his missing friend's name. The radios answered. One syllable, broken, mechanical, not quite his voice, but close enough to freeze them in place. They didn't speak, they didn't breathe. The chaparral to their right shuddered once. Then all movement stopped. Silence swallowed the trail again, thick and airtight. The friend closest to the slope whispered that they needed to run. The other nodded without hesitation. They turned to retreat down the ridge. Before they could take a step, a shape flickered at the corner of their vision. Not the missing friend, not a hiker, not an animal, a shadow, standing where their friend had been moments before. Tall, still, featureless, a void among the darkness. The flashlight beam curved toward it involuntarily, bending harder than before, as if pulled by the gravity of something the mind wasn't meant to interpret. The shadow didn't move. The friends did. They stepped backwards slowly, terrified to break into a run, terrified to turn their backs, terrified to test what would happen if they made a sudden noise. But the shadow held its ground, watching, waiting. The warm air pulsed again, and they realized the trail was no longer empty. The two friends stood frozen, their bodies locked in place by something more primal than fear. The shadow at the edge of the trail didn't move, didn't sway, didn't breathe. It stood perfectly still, as if the darkness itself had folded into a human shape and planted itself in their path. The flashlight beam continued bending toward it, drawn like a magnetic field pulling light instead of metal. Every instinct in their bodies screamed to retreat, but neither dared turn away. The friend holding the light took in a slow, shaking breath. The air tasted metallic, heavier than before, almost humid despite the cold night. He raised the beam a little higher. The shadow didn't react, but the bent light revealed a distortion around its edges, a faint ripple like the outline of something trying to hold shape, but failing to stay fully visible. It flickered just once, subtly enough to doubt your own eyes, before settling back into motionless black. Behind them, gravel shifted. One single crunch, a footstep. They spun around instantly, flashlights slicing the darkness. Nothing stood behind them. The trail was empty, no movement, no shifting shapes. Yet the sound had been unmistakably close. The one who wasn't holding the flashlight whispered his missing friend's name again. His voice cracked. The radios on their belts answered with a burst of warped static, a faint syllable, half-formed. Close to a human voice but fractured, like something mimicking the cadence without understanding how to finish the sound. The shadow on the trail moved, just an inch, a tilt, a shift of weight that the dirt somehow absorbed without leaving a mark. The friend with the flashlight stepped backward, his legs trembling. The beam bent so hard now that the center of the light curved back toward the shadow even when he tried to point it away. He tightened his grip, but the flashlight felt heavier, as if the air around it resisted his movements. Then the wind rose. A sudden warm blast surged upward from the slope, hitting them full force. It carried the metallic scent in a thick wave, pressing into their faces. Dust spiraled around the shadow, rising in a column that should have drifted apart in the night air. Instead, it tightened around the shape as if pulled into a vortex. The dust didn't blow away. It clung to the space around the shadow like static caught in a charged field. The radios erupted again, this time with a sound both men would later describe the same way. Breathing, not human breathing, too slow, too deep, something inhaling through a space too wide for lungs. A cavernous pull of air that shook their chests and weakened their knees. The shadow elongated suddenly, stretching upward in a quick, unnatural motion. The distortion around it sharpened, the edges blurring, as if reality itself resisted forming a clean outline. The bent flashlight beam snapped violently to the right, dragged across the trail toward the brush before the friend could react. He lost grip for a split second, and the flashlight nearly tore from his hand. He fought to hold it, fingers numb from the force. The shadow stepped forward. One step. No sound, no weight. But the dust behind it trembled, lifting slightly as if displaced by something moving through it. The friends stumbled backward. One tripped in the loose gravel, catching himself on his palms just as the flashlight beam flickered wildly. The shadow advanced again, the air pulsing with each motion. Warmth pressed into their faces, then dropped sharply into cold, as if the temperature couldn't decide where to settle around the entity. Then the slope behind them exhaled, a deep, hollow breath, a sound so close it vibrated their ribs. One of the friends broke. He bolted down the trail, sprinting blindly toward the faint glow of the distant streetlights. The other felt the sudden absence of his presence like a vacuum pulling at his spine. Instinct finally seized him too. He turned and ran. The radio screamed with static. The ground vibrated in short pulses beneath their shoes. The metallic odor thickened as they fled, as if the air behind them surged forward. One friend looked back only once. What he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. The shadow didn't chase them. It stood perfectly still at the center of the trail, watching. But behind it in the brush, something else moved. Not one shape, several. flickering in and out of visibility, like silhouettes sliding beneath a thin layer of warped air. As he ran, the friend realized something horrifying. The trail wasn't empty because their friend had vanished. The trail was empty because something else had arrived, and it wasn't alone. They didn't stop running until they reached the turnout near the trailhead. Both men stumbled into the gravel, lungs burning, hands shaking so violently they couldn't dial their phones at first. When they finally managed to call 911, the dispatcher could barely understand them through their fractured breathing. By the time the first patrol car arrived, both friends were still staring back up the trail, terrified the shadow would follow them down the ridge. But the darkness above remained still, giving no sign of movement, no hint of what they had seen. Officers walked them through the events slowly, trying to untangle their disjointed explanations. The upright flashlight, the bending beam, the warm gusts of metallic air, the faint impressions in the dust, the shadow, the silhouettes flickering in the brush, their missing friend vanishing mid-sentence. The story sounded impossible, ungrounded, the frantic rambling of two men caught in an adrenaline storm. But the deputies couldn't ignore the panic etched into their faces or the fact that both described the same details independently. A search began immediately. Officers swept the trail with high-powered lights, calling the missing man's name, expecting him to be injured or confused. But as they approached the midpoint where the friends had lost sight of him, the radios crackled with the same unnatural static the friends described. A deputy paused and tried again. More static. A low, warped tone threaded through the interference. He turned to call for another radio. That was when he noticed the temperature change. A sudden pocket of heat rolled over the trail, brushing against his face like the breath of something standing too close. The metallic scent followed, sharp and unmistakable. He swung his flashlight toward the slope. The beam bent, not flickered, not glitched, bent. He stiffened. The other deputies noticed it too. One swore under his breath. The light curved harder the closer he aimed toward the chaparral, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, something like a silhouette formed behind the brush, a suggestion of height, a vague shape, a distortion in the darkness that vanished when he tried to focus on it. They continued their search anyway, but every deputy felt it. The pressure, a tightening in the air around their ribs, the same silent compression reported in the earlier disappearances. They reached the center of the trail where the friend's flashlight had been found. The dirt was as smooth as if someone had just swept it. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no marks indicating their missing friend had fallen or run or turned sharply off the path. But there was something else. A small object lying in the dust. His phone, sitting upright, balanced, screen facing the slope. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. One reached down to pick it up, but before his hand touched the device, the phone lit up on its own. The screen flashed a distorted image, static, warped pixels, nothing identifiable, before shutting off instantly. When the deputy pressed the power button, the phone remained dead. Another deputy pointed to the dust around the phone. A new impression. Shallow, long, smooth, warm. A match to the marks found in the earlier disappearances. Not human, not animal. A shape that didn't belong on any trail. The deputies backed away instinctively. They conducted a full sweep of the ridge until well past midnight. Nothing else was found. No voice called back to them. No rustle came from the brush. The air eventually cooled, the metallic scent thinning into the night. But the sense of being watched lingered long after they returned to the trailhead. The official report cited unknown circumstances and likely accidental separation from companions. But off the record, several deputies admitted nothing about that night felt accidental. They said the trail felt occupied. They said the silence behaved like a living thing. They said the air bent around the beam of their lights in ways physics couldn't justify. And none of them missed the fact that 3 disappearances now shared the same signature. The bending of the light, the metallic warmth, the smooth crescent-shaped impressions, and the sudden complete absence of footprints. 2 weeks after the search ended, a cyclist riding the ridge before sunrise caught something strange on his helmet camera. A faint, low hum rising in the background as he pedaled. He didn't hear it in person, but the camera picked it up. Steady, rhythmic, almost like a breath. When he slowed to adjust his gear, the hum grew louder. Then the camera jittered. For one frame, a shadow stood near the midpoint of the trail. No features, no edges, just a shape darker than the surrounding night. One frame later, it was gone. The missing hiker was never found. His flashlight sits in evidence storage, still functional, though technicians could never explain why its beam angled unnaturally during tests. The impression in the soil faded with the first rain. The trail reopened, people returned, but fewer hikers walk the ridge alone now. And those who do avoid stopping near the spot where he vanished, they say the wind feels wrong there. They say the air thickens around your ribs. They say that if the night grows too still and the metallic scent drifts through the sagebrush, you should turn back immediately, because no one has seen him since. By the time the third disappearance hit the news, Mulholland Trail had become a place people talked about only in half-jokes or uncomfortable silences. Locals pretended not to notice how quickly the ridge emptied after sunset. Regular hikers changed their routines. Evening runners shifted to morning routes. Dog walkers avoided the midpoint entirely. Even the more skeptical outdoor groups started warning newcomers about that stretch near the chaparral without explaining why. It wasn't the stories that changed their behavior. It was the way the trail felt. No one trusted the silence anymore. A pattern had formed, one so quiet and subtle that authorities refused to address it publicly. But people who lived near the ridge, who hiked it regularly, who knew the land and its moods, pieced it together faster than anyone expected. Subtle warmth in the soil, the metallic scent drifting without a source, light bending in directions no flashlight should bend, smooth indentations in the dirt that didn't match human or animal movement, vanishings without footprints, without sound, without a trail to follow. And every time the same detail appeared. Someone vanished only moments after reacting to something just off the trail. A sound, a shift of air, a movement at the corner of their vision. But the fourth disappearance was the one that spread fear beyond the hiking community. It wasn't a runner. It wasn't an afternoon walker. It wasn't a group of friends enjoying a nighttime ridge. The fourth case involved someone no one expected. A man who lived near the trail. A man who wasn't hiking at all. A man who was at home, safe indoors with his doors locked and his windows closed, when he vanished. He didn't step onto the trail willingly. He didn't climb the ridge. He didn't wander outside. And yet he ended up there. People in the nearby houses heard it first. A dull thud against the hillside, a dog barking violently, a porch light flickering on and off, a noise like something heavy dragging across gravel. When neighbors looked out their windows, they saw nothing moving on the trail, nothing shifting in the yards, nothing running through the brush. But 30 minutes later, his front door stood wide open. The lights in his house were still on. The food on his stove was still warm. The television was playing. His shoes remained in place by the entryway, and he was gone. When police traced the scene, they found a single set of footprints leading away from his home, his own. But those prints didn't lead anywhere. They walked in a straight line toward the ridge, growing lighter and lighter, until they stopped on Mulholland Trail at the exact point where the other disappearances had occurred. No prints continued. No prints returned. And beside the last footprint was a warm, crescent-shaped indentation in the dirt. Smooth, precise, identical to the others. The man had been taken from his home, and his trail ended in a place he had not walked to. That is where the fourth story begins. He wasn't the type to take risks, not the type to wander outside late at night, not the type to explore ridges or trails simply because they were near his home. He worked early, came home early, kept a predictable routine, and rarely deviated from the small, comfortable orbit of his neighborhood. Friends described him as steady. Neighbors called him reliable. His sister said he valued safety more than anything else. He lived alone in a small house tucked just below the Mulholland Ridge, close enough to see the trail from his backyard, but far enough that he never felt connected to it. On the night he vanished, nothing about his evenings suggested trouble. He cooked dinner, left the television playing in the background, and texted his sister about picking up a package she'd accidentally sent to his address. His phone records show he ordered a small part for a home project and browsed online for almost an hour. No suspicious searches, no strange conversations, no signs of agitation. His last text message, sent at 8:42 p.m., was a simple reminder to his sister. "Just stop by tomorrow, I'll leave the gate unlocked." At 9:05 p.m., neighbors heard his dog barking. Not casual barking, not alert barking, a frantic, sustained burst of panic. Several neighbors noted the sound instantly. They said they had never heard the dog behave like that. Then, almost as suddenly as it started, the barking stopped, abruptly, mid-yelp, followed by a heavy thud that seemed to echo from the hillside behind the houses. A neighbor later said the thud didn't sound like something hitting the ground. It sounded like something large shifting its weight. Lights flickered on several porches. One neighbor stepped outside, scanning the yard between their homes. They saw nothing. No shadow, no movement, no sign of an intruder, but they felt unsettled without understanding why. The air carried a thickness they couldn't explain, a warm current drifting through the cold night, carrying a metallic scent that didn't belong to the neighborhood. Around 9:20 p.m., a second neighbor noticed something strange. His house lights flickered twice. Not a power surge, not random, controlled, as if someone had flipped a switch rapidly. He checked his fuse box. Everything looked normal. He returned inside, but when he stepped past his living room window, he caught a glimpse of something on the ridge, just a flicker, a distortion along the trail above their homes. A ripple of darkness sliding between patches of moonlight. He blinked. The movement stopped. The ridge looked empty again. He convinced himself it was nothing. By 9:40 p.m., a neighbor across the street saw the man's front door standing wide open. The porch light was still on. The television inside played softly, and the man's dog, who had barked so violently earlier, was nowhere in sight. The neighbor called for him, no answer. He approached with caution, expecting to find the man injured or dealing with a break-in. Instead, he found the house undisturbed. The dinner plate on the counter still warm, a cup beside the sink half full. The man's shoes rested neatly beside the entryway. His keys hung on the hook. His jacket remained on the chair. Nothing was broken, nothing was missing, except him. Police arrived within minutes. They searched the house from top to bottom, checking closets, bathrooms, the backyard, the side gates. Everything was intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no reason for the man to have left voluntarily. His phone sat on the coffee table, screen still lit from a video that had been paused mid-frame, as if he had stood up abruptly. But then an officer noticed the back door, unlocked, partially open. A faint trail of disturbed dust marked the concrete, as though someone had walked through barefoot or dragged something lightly. The trail led into the yard, across the grass, toward the fence, and then beyond it, straight toward the ridge. The officers followed the faint marks with their flashlights, tracing the path up the slope. They moved slowly, expecting the trail to stop at the fence or vanish into the brush. Instead, the marks continued upward in a perfectly straight line, moving toward the Mulholland Trail as if the man had walked there deliberately. But there was a problem. The marks were not footprints, they were indentations, long, smooth, curved, pressed evenly into the soil, matching the shape found in the previous disappearances. The officers followed the path all the way to the trail, and there, at the center of the ridge, the indentations stopped. Perfectly. Beside them was a single footprint. His footprint, the last one he ever made. Something felt slightly off. The officers knelt beside the final footprint, studying the way it pressed into the dust. It was unmistakably his. The tread matched the shoes left by his front door. The weight distribution aligned with his stride, but the depth of the impression was wrong, too shallow for a man his size, as if he had stepped there without fully placing his weight on the ground, as if his body had been partially supported by something else when he made that last movement. The smooth indentation beside it was even stranger. It curved gently across the soil, a perfect crescent pressed into the earth with no signs of drag or rotation, no shifting dirt along the edges, no break in the pattern. It looked like an object had rested there with steady pressure, not for long, but long enough to alter the shape of the trail. The officer closest to it reached out his hand. He stopped just above the indentation. Heat radiated from the soil. The night air was cold. The ground should have matched that temperature. But the indentation pulsed faintly with warmth, as if something had been there moments before they arrived. The officer reported the detail quietly over the radio. His voice came through distorted in his partner's earpiece. A thin static started to bleed into the transmission. Not loud, just enough to raise the tiny hairs on their arms. The partner adjusted his radio. The static softened, then surged again in a short burst, almost rhythmic, like the tail end of a mechanical breath. He looked toward the ridge instinctively. The air above the trail shimmered, only for a second. A ripple, a faint distortion, like heat rising from pavement. But the night was cold, and the soil beneath them was cold. Only that one indentation held warmth. Another officer swept his flashlight across the trail. The beam caught the dust, illuminated the footprint, and slid across the smooth indentation. When the light hit the far edge of it, the beam bent slightly, a subtle curve, a pull. Not strong, but enough to see, enough to freeze him mid-scan. He aimed the flashlight again, straight and steady. The beam curved again. He turned it off, then on. Same result. He didn't say a word. He simply lowered the flashlight and stepped back. The officers continued up the trail, following the faint marks left in the soil leading from the man's home. The strange indentations appeared sporadically, each one warm to the touch, each one pressed into the ground with the same unnatural precision. They formed no recognizable pattern, no spacing consistent with footsteps or dragging. They looked more like the trace of something that moved without stepping. When they reached a flat section of the ridge, one officer bent down and touched the soil again. The heat felt stronger there, not burning, not dangerous, but present, radiating upward like a living pulse. He jerked his hand back quickly. The metallic scent arrived next. It drifted in slow, soft waves, faint at first, then sharper, warmer, like the smell of heated wiring. One officer whispered that it reminded him of the odor inside an old transformer box. Another said it smelled like static itself, like the air before a lightning strike. The scent didn't move with the wind. It hovered, centered near the final indentation. The air thickened. Silence deepened. For a moment, every officer on that ridge felt the atmosphere compress. Their ears tightened, as if pressure changed without warning. The feeling was brief but unmistakable, like stepping into a room where the air had weight. They called the missing man's name. No echo answered. No sound returned. Their voices died quickly in the dense air. Then a sudden gust of warm wind slid across the trail, sweeping in a straight line from the slope to the ridge. It hit the officers' faces, carrying the metallic scent strongly enough to sting their noses. Dust rose in a thin spiral, circling once before falling flat into complete stillness. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Something had moved the air, but nothing stood on the trail. The warmth faded. The metallic scent thinned, and before the officers could regroup, one of them pointed at the dirt beside the indentation. A new impression was forming, not fully, not visibly pushed by anything. Just a subtle sinking of the soil, a deepening curve. As if something unseen were resting its weight into the ground right in front of them. The officers froze. Whatever had taken him hadn't left the ridge. It was standing there with them. The officers didn't move at first. None of them breathed deeply. None of them dared shift their feet. They stood in a tightening semicircle around the fresh indentation forming in the dust, watching the soil sink grain by grain. It wasn't falling the way loose earth normally collapses. It was lowering evenly with measured pressure, as though something were pressing slowly into the trail from above. The shape broadened by barely a centimeter, but the movement felt immense, the kind of change that pulls the stomach into knots even when the eyes struggle to interpret what they're seeing. A deputy whispered that they needed to step back. His voice came out thin, pushed through the heavy air like it had to fight to be heard at all. Another officer nodded, but none of them took the first step. The warmth rising from the indentation intensified. A pulse of heat radiated outward, brushing their shins. The metallic scent sharpened again, coating the back of their throats with an electric tang. The radios crackled, not with random interference, with movement. a faint oscillation in the static, rising and falling in a slow, unnatural rhythm. One deputy lifted his radio toward his ear, but the tone deepened, vibrating through the device like something breathing inside the circuitry. He dropped it immediately. A soft scrape came from the brush below the ridge. Not an animal, not wind, something deliberate, slow, dragging, measured. The officers turned their flashlights toward the slope. The beams extended over the brush but bent just slightly at the edges, like gravity was tilting the light toward a single point. One deputy steadied his hand, testing the angle. The light curved again. The officer beside him whispered that the beam was behaving the way metal behaves near a magnet. Only nothing visible was creating the pull. The scraping sound returned closer this time, a low shift of weight through dry leaves. The deputies raised their weapons automatically, though none of them believed a tangible threat stood in the brush. They scanned the slope carefully, but every flashlight flickered with the same bending distortion, refusing to show whatever moved between the branches. The air thickened more. A pressure built behind their ears, a deep inward tightening that made several deputies swallow hard to ease the discomfort. The temperature fluctuated rapidly, cold rushing in from the hillside, followed by a wave of warm air that brushed across their faces like breath. The metallic scent spiked, then faded, then surged again in a strange pattern. A deputy took a half-step backward. The soil beside the indentation trembled. A faint vibration rose through the ground, small but undeniable, prickling through the soles of their boots. It wasn't the rolling vibration of distant machinery or passing cars. It was steadier, closer, almost like something large shifting beneath the trail, pushing lightly upward. The radios erupted again, this time with a single sound, a clipped, broken syllable, human-shaped but not human. It was too fragmented to understand, too distorted to recognize, but the cadence sent a shock of fear through every officer. The sound repeated once, quieter, like something imitating a voice without knowing how to form the words. The indentation deepened one more inch. One of the officers drew a sharp breath. He swore he saw the air ripple above the indentation, a thin shimmer, as if heat were rising from something invisible. But the night was cold. The soil around it was cold. Only the shape in the earth held warmth. The slope rustled violently. All flashlights swung together. Something moved between the branches, not a shape, not a figure. A distortion, like a shadow, where there was no source of light, sliding across the brush in a smooth, gliding motion. The beam of the nearest flashlight bent toward it, pulled out of its natural angle as if dragged. The officer holding it tightened his grip, but the beam continued to bend, curving toward the distortion, even as he fought to turn it away. Then it stopped. The distortion froze. The air dropped into complete silence. No rustle, no static, no breath, nothing. A deputy whispered his missing name. The indentation pulsed, the air warmed, and a second, fainter indentation began forming beside the first. Something unseen was no longer arriving. It was surrounding them. The officers tightened their formation instinctively, backs inching toward one another, as the second indentation deepened beside the first. The soil lowered in a slow, steady compression, like the imprint of a knee or a hand pressing into dirt without a physical body attached. The heat from the ground intensified, radiating upward in pulses that made their legs prickle. The metallic scent thickened, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. No one dared speak, no one dared move. A deputy raised his flashlight, hand trembling. The beam stretched across the trail, caught the first indentation, then curved sharply toward the slope in a way that made the light look dragged. He tried to correct the angle, but the beam fought him, bending harder the more he resisted. It was like the air itself was pulling the light towards something just out of view. That was when the brush below the ridge shifted, not the rustling of leaves, not the scurry of animals. A low, deliberate pressure against the chaparral, as though something large was pushing through without disturbing a single branch. The officers aimed their lights into the slope, but the beams warped again, bending toward a single point that none of them could see. The distortion flickered once, twice, a ripple of shape in the darkness, visible only in the way the moonlight behind it bent unnaturally. One of the deputies whispered that there was something in the brush. His voice cracked, breaking the unnatural silence like a dropped stone. The ground trembled in response, a faint vibration rolling under their boots. The soil inside the indentations sank deeper. A third indentation began forming inches away, shallow at first, then sharpening into the same crescent shape as the others. 3 shapes, 3 points of weight, 3 unseen forms closing in around them. The radios crackled again, louder than before. A sharp burst of static fractured into a distorted tone that rose and fell in an uneven rhythm. The cadence was almost human, almost a voice, but wrong, too hollow, too stretched. Like something imitating language without understanding the shape of words. The deputy holding the nearest radio took one involuntary step backward. The slope reacted instantly. A surge of warm air blasted upward, slamming into the officers with such force that several of them staggered. The metallic scent washed over them in a thick wave. Dust spiraled off the ground, circling the 3 indentations before dispersing in a sharp downward collapse. One flashlight flickered violently, another dimmed. A third bent its beam so far off axis that the light swept sideways into the brush despite the officer aiming forward. Then the distortion rose. It lifted from the slope, a dark shimmer peeling free from the chaparral like the outline of a shadow detaching from the ground. It didn't have features. It didn't have limbs. It didn't even have a consistent shape. It was a void, a moving absence, its edges trembling as though it struggled to hold itself together. The moonlight behind it warped, bending around the thing in ripples like a gravitational field. The officers aimed their lights at it. The beams bent into arcs, curving toward the distortion, being pulled into it. The void shifted forward, not walking, sliding. A smooth gliding motion that erased distance without any visible step. One deputy raised his weapon. Another grabbed his arm immediately, terrified that any sudden noise might provoke whatever stood before them. The temperature swung again, first freezing cold, then intensely warm. Their skin prickled, their breaths came in strained bursts, their ears buzzed with pressure. A deputy whispered the missing man's name. The distortion reacted, not visually, not physically. The radios did. All at once, every radio shrieked with a single fractured syllable. Not quite his voice, not quite human. A broken imitation strung through layers of static. The distortion surged toward them in a sudden, jarring lurch, closing half the distance in less than a heartbeat. The officers stumbled backward, flashlights jerking downward. The beams bent harder, twisting like electrical arcs pulled off their natural paths. The indentations in the soil deepened rapidly, then collapsed. All 3 at once, a thud rippled through the ground. The distortion halted in front of them, flickering violently now, as though it strained against the very fabric of the space it occupied. Then, without warning, the void collapsed in on itself, shrinking inward, twisting into a tight knot of darkness that winked out like a flame being snuffed. Silence slammed down. The metallic scent vanished. The heat evaporated, and the ridge returned to stillness, as if nothing had been there at all. But something had been, and it had taken him. The ridge stayed unnervingly quiet after the void collapsed. The officers stood in the stillness, waiting for the air to shift again, waiting for the metallic scent to return, waiting for the radios to crackle with that broken imitation of a voice. But nothing happened. No sound rose from the chaparral. No heat radiated from the soil. The night resumed its natural cold, as though nothing unnatural had passed through it. The deputies regrouped slowly, shaken, unable to speak at first. When they finally forced themselves to check the trail, they found the 3 indentations filled with cooling dust. The shapes had softened, as though whatever weight had pressed into them had lifted only moments before. But the warmth lingered faintly. One deputy crouched and held his hand 2 inches above the soil. The heat pulsed once, a final breath of warmth, then faded completely. They swept the ridge with flashlights, searching desperately for footprints, drag marks, anything that might indicate where the missing man, or the distortion, had gone. But the soil remained untouched. The dust lay perfectly smooth in places, as if the trail itself had been wiped clean. Not by wind, by intention. When they followed the faint trail of indentations back toward the man's home, they noticed something else. The marks grew farther apart as they descended the slope. The spacing widened in a way no human stride could match. The indentations were deeper earlier on the trail and shallower closer to the houses, as though whatever moved had become lighter the farther it traveled. Thin as air. Then nothing. Halfway down the slope, the marks stopped completely. No transition, no fade. A sudden end. The deputies fanned out, scanning the hillside. Their radios behaved normally again. The air felt ordinary. The temperature held steady. The metallic smell was gone entirely. Logic told them that the man must have been dragged or carried the rest of the way, but the soil didn't agree. No prints, no broken stems, no bent grass, no evidence of passage. It was as if he had dissolved into the air halfway down the ridge. They returned to his home in silence. The house looked exactly the same as they had left it. The front door still open, the lights still on, the unfinished dinner still warm on the counter, the television still playing. But something new stood in the center of the living room. Something no one had seen there before. A shoe, his shoe, not tossed, not dropped, placed upright, facing the back door. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, none of them willing to touch it. The shoe was warm. So warm that one officer jerked his hand back immediately. The warmth wasn't natural. It wasn't the heat of a foot or the lingering warmth of a room. It felt like heated metal beneath rubber, like the kind of warmth generated by machinery, not by people. As they stood there, the ceiling light flickered, twice, controlled, not random, as if something had passed through the wiring. The dog was never found. No tracks, no sound, nothing. His family asked the deputies if they believed he had walked up the ridge willingly. None of them could answer honestly. Every detail contradicted the idea. His shoes left behind, his keys on the hook, his jacket untouched. His phone still on the coffee table, his dinner warm, the television on, the open back door, the indentations leading toward the trail, his single footprint, the warm soil, the fractured voice in the radio. None of it matched human behavior. The search extended for days, then weeks. A helicopter swept the ridge. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Rangers assisted. Drones flew the length of the trail. Nothing was found. Not clothing, not remains, not evidence. Nothing but the same warm spots of soil forming and fading in strange arcs along the ridge, nowhere near where the deputies walked. Shortly after the search was called off, a neighbor reported something strange on his door camera. At 3:17 a.m., the camera recorded a short burst of static. The image flickered, then a shadow appeared at the edge of the frame. Tall, still, featureless. For 3 seconds, the shadow remained. The streetlight behind it bent slightly as if pulled. Then the shadow collapsed inward and vanished. The next morning, the neighbor found a crescent-shaped indentation in the dirt beside his fence. Warm, smooth, perfectly pressed, identical to the others. The disappearance of the man in the house became the fourth case in a chain of vanishings no one wanted to acknowledge. His home still stands near the ridge. His porch light still flickers at odd hours. And some nights, when the wind dies completely and the air feels unnaturally warm, neighbors say the metallic scent returns. Soft, thin, lingering. They say the ridge grows quiet then. Too quiet. And they say that if you ever hear a single thud against the hillside, you should stay inside, turn off your lights and wait for the air to cool again, because no one has seen him since.